Yo, what's up guys? It's the new sensation, Bigger Notation here, and today I'm going to be bringing you a deck profile that I've been wanting to do for a really long time, but I just haven't been able to get the cards together to actually do it, and I've been really enjoying doing these in-person deck profiles with actual real cards rather than just doing the ones online with DBS Deck Planet, because I feel like it's a lot easier to go through and explain all of the different combos that you can do within a deck, and just going through individual card choices is a lot easier, and I think it's just nicer in general to have the actual cards shown for you guys. So I've been really enjoying doing this format, and that's why I wanted to get the actual cards together for this deck, because there's a lot of combos you can do with this deck and it's really good fun. I've kind of had my eye on this leader for a while. As you can see, it's the starter Frieza leader that came out the same time as Vegex, and back when they both came out, I picked up both the starter decks because I was interested in both of them. Obviously, Vegex, we all know, was a completely dominant force for like a year or so. But starter Frieza never really saw the light of day. But I really like the leader. It's very, very interesting. It's got a very unique take on hand destruction. I don't think any other hand control deck really plays similarly to this deck, because it's got a lot of unique cards that it can run. But we'll just get straight into the deck profile. I want to preface this by saying that this deck is very, very sequencing intensive, so there's a lot of sequencing that you have to do correctly to play this deck properly. So it can be quite tricky to play for sometimes, but I'll go through some of the basic combos that you can do with the deck that are really what makes the deck interesting to me. I really like the combos you can do with this deck. So just to start off with the leader, for those who don't know, it's a pretty unknown leader, I'd argue. So it has a permanent where you can't include any Saiyan cards in your deck. So already that's obviously really restrictive, because some of the best cards in the game are going to be Saiyans. Most of the secret rares and super combos in the game are Saiyans. So this makes it quite tricky to actually put a deck together. But generally, the only card that I found that I've missed from this permanent is the Son Goku Power of Legends, that he's a 15k crit and he free plays himself when your opponent discards a card. That's the main card that I've missed from that permanent, but obviously now it's banned, and so I thought this was a perfect time to profile this deck to you guys, because I don't really miss a huge amount from that restriction, honestly. His frontside auto is you choose a Frieza's army in your battle area and place it in the drop area. And then when this attacks a leader card, your opponent chooses one card in their hand and discards it, and then you add up to one card from your life to your hand. So, as you can see, this leader doesn't draw on the front side inherently, it only takes its own life, which is kind of annoying. At least it helps you self-awaken, because the backside is where this leader gets particularly strong. And your opponent is going to be discarding cards on swing, which is still kind of nice, but because they'll probably be taking life because you have to swing at a leader card for this effect to trigger, it kind of means that they're going even, so they're not really losing out on anything, and you're just taking your own life, which is technically a +1, but it's like you're going to take that life eventually anyway, really. So it's not the most amazing frontside in the world. Its awaken is when your life is at 4 or less, you untap one, draw one. And then the backside is where things get really interesting. So on the backside we have Last Resort Frieza. And most of this deck's game plan is to kind of mitigate for the front side of the leader being so bad, because once you get to the backside, that's when things start properly happening. And so you kind of want to awaken as fast as you can, so you take a lot of life in the early game, and then you try and get to your backside as soon as possible. So on the backside, when this card attacks, you draw a card, so you actually gain some card draw on the backside, which is really helpful. But then the frontside auto kind of gets transferred into a better activate main. So the activate main, for once per turn, you send a Frieza's army from your battle area into the drop area. Then you choose one card in your opponent's hand and discard it, so you get to choose, a bit like Cell's Earth Destroying Kamehameha. So you get to choose, which is incredibly strong, because it means randomly you can just hit secret rares and things out of the opponent's hand with this. And then if that wasn't good enough, you then get to choose one of your green Unisons and give it critical, which is obviously insane, because it gives you another swing that you can do with crit, and it really helps out this deck, and we'll show why later on. But it really does wonders for the deck. So for the first card and the main card in the deck, we have 4 of the Dodoria, Frieza's Devoted Servant. And I want to preface this by saying that a lot of these cards really rely on you having Unisons, because these starter decks were released around the time that Unison started being released as well. I think it was around set 10. And so they were obviously pushing the Unison mechanic really hard. And some of these cards basically rely on you controlling Unisons, which is why the Unisons we run in this deck are particularly sticky. So this Dodoria, if your leader is a green Frieza and you have a green Unison card in play, and this card is placed in the drop area from your hand, you can play this card from the drop area. So that's really helpful. If this card gets discarded from your hand, you can then play it out for free. And that means that you'll have Frieza's army cards on the board to sack off for your leader's effects, which is really helpful. We have a couple of ways to discard this card from our hand later down the line. Obviously, you may be thinking this is only useful against another hand control deck, but you have ways to discard this card inherently in this deck. And then he also has an activate main for 1 green energy. If your leader is a green Frieza card and you have a green Unison card in play, add this card from your drop area to your hand. So you can constantly cycle this guy, which is really helpful, and it just gives you so much value throughout the game. And I would argue that this deck is it's a hand control deck, obviously, but it's probably the most control slanted hand control deck that I've ever played, because it just, the longer the game goes on, the more value you're able to generate and the more cards you're able to rip out your opponent's hand. It's really, really good in the long game. So you just want to go, you'll often go to like turn 5, turn 6, turn 7 with this deck and just keep trying to draw cards and rip cards out your opponent's hand. So to synergize with the Dodoria, I'm actually running 4 copies of Frieza Army Healing Pod. And this card is insane in this deck because you have a lot of drop area effects. If you want a deck that has a lot of drop area recursion, this is probably the deck for you. For those who don't know, this is a field card. It just sits on your board, and once per turn when you play a green battle card from your drop area, you draw a card. It also has an activate main for 2 green and 2 unspecified energy, where you place this card in the drop area and revive a 4 cost from your drop area, and that can come up sometimes. Your 4 drops in this deck are kind of your finishers, if you want to call it that. Most of the battle cards in this deck don't really do any damage. You're mostly relying on ripping your opponent's hand out and then swinging for crit with your Unison. But there's a couple of battle cards that are 4 drops in this deck that I would consider finishers. And so to synergize with this package, I'm actually running 3 copies of Zarbon Cosmic Elite. This card is incredible to synergize with this package, because things you can do with this card is just for 1 energy, whilst he's in your drop area and Dodoria is in your hand, if you have Healing Pod down, you tap 1 energy, bring out Zarbon, discard Dodoria. Healing Pod lets you draw a card, Dodoria revives itself, and then you have 2 bodies to sack off with your leader's skills. And if you sack off Zarbon and they have 5 or more cards in hand after the initial drop a card from the leader, they'll have to discard another card, and then you can revive Zarbon again from the drop area, because neither of his effects are once per turn. So you can keep on recurring Zarbon and keep on sacking it off from your battle area for your leader skills, and then your opponent will effectively have to drop 2 cards every time, which is just incredible. And then for some more of the initial Frieza's army support we have is going to be 3 copies of Ginyu Captain of the Elite. This is one of the promos for the deck. He's 3-drop 10k, but during your opponent's turn, if you control a green Unison, this card becomes a 1-drop. So again, relying on having sticky Unisons down on the board. He's got a counter attack effect where you negate the attack and play this card, so that's why his cost is reduced during your opponent's turn. And then he has an auto. When this card is played, you add up to 1 green Frieza's army with a power of 9k power or less from your drop area to your hand, and then if you do, you have to discard a card from your hand. So initially this looks like it's not very good because you're going even, you're adding a card back, but then you have to discard a card as well. But if you combine that with Dodoria, even if you just add Dodoria back from your drop area and then discard it, it will play itself down. And then if you have Frieza's Army Healing Pod on the board, that will let you draw a card, even though it's during your opponent's turn, because it triggers once during your turn, once during your opponent's turn. So a lot of the way you gain advantage with this deck is by discarding Dodoria's once on your turn and then once on your opponent's turn, or reviving Zarbon's on your turn and then discarding Dodoria's on your opponent's turn for cards like this Ginyu. And then if you already have Dodoria in your hand, you can, or a Zarbon in your hand that you want to get into the drop, you can grab back some of your other Frieza's armies, which we'll get into just now. So for the last Frieza's army that is specific to this leader, we have 2 copies of Zarbon, Frieza's right-hand man. And then this is the main target for Ginyu if you already have a Dodoria in your hand to discard from its effect. So this Zarbon, he's just very simple. When this card is played, you look at the top 5 cards of your deck and you add up to 1 green Unison with a specified cost of 2, or a green Frieza's army card with an energy cost of 4 or less among them to your hand. And he also has an activate battle skill in the drop area for 1 energy. If your leader is a green Frieza and you have a green Unison card in play, you can send him from the drop area to your warp, and then you can choose one of your leader cards or Unison cards and it gets plus 10k power for the battle. So that last effect really catches people off guard because they don't expect it. When they're going in for the kill, you can just tap 2 energy, warp both of these at your drop area, and your leader becomes 35k for the battle, plus any combos that you might have. So this guy is really nice defensively, and he obviously searches out all of the cards that we've just been through. The reason I'm only running it at 2 is just because I couldn't really find space for a 3rd and 4th. This card is really not that key of a card, because most of the time you'll see your Dodoria and your Zarbon early enough that it's fine to just run 2 copies of this card. And also 1 energy in this deck is really, really expensive, because a lot of the time you're just spending 1 energy to add back your Dodorias, and then spending another energy to cycle in Zarbons, discarding Dodorias, and then triggering Frieza Army Healing Pod. So 1 energy is really expensive in this deck, and you only ever need this card if you haven't seen either Dodoria or Zarbon yet, because those are the 2 main cards for the deck. Also, we don't run a specified cost 2 Unison in this deck. We're running a 1 cost and a 3 cost, which I'm about to get into. But I have considered running the Bardock Paternal Unison as well. But I think that the Unisons that we're running are a lot better just because they're a lot stickier in the deck. Like, you can, once they've been established onto the board, you can kind of guarantee that they're going to sit there for a really long time. And because you need a Unison to activate Dodoria and to trigger Ginyu, it's really, really key that you can keep your Unison alive, and Bardock just doesn't really offer that kind of protection. So for the first Unison, obviously, you probably guessed it, we've got 4 copies of Demigra. Like I've mentioned before, we want a sticky Unison, and this card is probably the stickiest Unison in the game, and you can get it down turn 1, which means that your Dodorias are going to be live, and your Ginyus are going to be live throughout the rest of the game. And then we also have 3 copies of the Dark Broly Unison. This card is just popping up everywhere throughout this metagame. The main reason that this card is so insane in this deck, especially, is that you can give your Unison crit off of your backside activate main, and so you can be swinging 20k double strike crit with this guy every single turn, which is just insane. His +2, which is you both players discard a card and then your opponent chooses one of their battle cards and KOs it, is also insane in this deck, because not only do you have a bunch of drop area effects similar to how a Cell Surge might play, but you can also discard Dodoria off of this effect, and then Dodoria will obviously revive itself, and Frieza Army Healing Pod will then trigger to draw you a card. So this card actually just pluses you a bunch of advantage whilst whittling down your opponent's resources, which is just insane. And then obviously swinging double strike crit every single turn is so stupid. And the fact that it's so impossible to remove this guy, because turn 3 he's going to come down for 5 markers, 20k Unison, is really, really strong. The main thing that this deck struggles with, which you can probably guess, is playing against blue-yellow, because they have Zamasu the Eliminator, and Dark Broly is going to be the main way that you're gaining advantage. So Zamasu the Eliminator kind of counters this deck, and you want to be really careful of that if you're playing against blue-yellow to play around it. A lot of the time, if you can see Demigra on early on enough, then you don't need to worry about dropping the Dark Broly until much later on in the game, and then you can afford to tap 5 for it to play around Zamasu. But yeah, it definitely hinders this deck, especially if you can't see Demigra early. And then obviously we're a green deck, we're running Unison, so we're going to run 4 copies of Frieza Charismatic Villain. Another really nice thing about this deck in particular is that this card is a Frieza's Army, so it has synergy with your deck, it has synergy with your leader. You can sack it off for your leader's effects to make your opponent discard cards. So unlike with most decks, when this guy is just sat around on the board, he's a 10k that can't really swing into anything, this card can actually put in work in this deck just as another Frieza's Army tag, which is really, really helpful. And that's a reason why we're not running the 5-drop Zamasu in this deck, because the 5-drop Zamasu is obviously incredibly good with the Frieza in any sort of hand control deck, because it synergizes really well with it. You can just sack it off, drop the 5-drop Zamasu, and then your opponent discards a card every single turn. But Like I mentioned earlier, 1 energy is really expensive in this deck because you're going to be cycling through Zarbons and Dodorias so much. And the fact that this guy sticks around on the board for this deck is really not like a bad thing at all. And it can still be very useful on the board without having Zamasu in the deck because of your leader's effects. And then, again, we're a green deck, we're running Unisons, we're going to run 4 Dormant. This is your main way to protect yourself throughout your opponent's turn. We don't really run much defensive tools. We have the 3 Ginyus as a nice negate, we have the 4 Dormants, we have a couple more negates which I'm about to get into, but this is your main protection during your opponent's turn. Because a lot of the time you're burning through most of your energy during your turn to loop Zarbon and Dodoria. Zarbon offers a little extra protection, and it's really nice that you have a blocker in this deck inherently, because then you can Dormant during the counter window when your opponent attacks, and then block with the Zarbon, and then your opponent only has 1 more attack for the rest of the turn, and that will mean that you can then negate their last attack with either the Ginyu or another negate that you might be running. Another thing that this card is really good in this deck is that when you discard a card off of Dormant Potential, you can discard Dodoria. Dodoria then revives itself because you have a green Unison card in play, and then Frieza Army Healing Pod will trigger during your opponent's turn and let you draw a card. So like I mentioned earlier, you want to be triggering Frieza Army Healing Pod as much as you can during your opponent's turn as well as your own turn, and Dormant is another way to let you do that, as well as offering you some incredible protection. So Dormant Potential is, even when you discard a card, if you're discarding Dodoria and you have Healing Pod down, it actually doesn't minus you any sort of card advantage because Dodoria plays itself and then you draw a card, and that replaces the 2 cards you lost. And then for the last negate we're running in the deck, I'm running 2 Homicidal Clones. I would really like to push this up to 3, but I just can't find the space, and I think that 2 is probably working okay just because you have Ginyu negates, you have 4 Dormants, and you have Zarbon to block effectively anyway. Homicidal Clones is mostly good against aggro decks to help you in aggressive matchups, but there isn't really much aggro running around, so I don't think I need to warrant playing a 3rd copy. And obviously the card is still really good against control decks as well. It's just a good all-round card in general. For the next kind of set of cards that we're playing, I am running 3 copies of Surprise Attack Frieza. This is to synergize with the Dark Broly Unison, because when your opponent KOs a card from the Dark Broly +2 effect, you can then play this guy down and have a 15k crit swing. And then I'm also running 3 of the 1-star ball, 2 of the Frieza, and 4 copies of Dabura to synergize again with the Dark Broly Unison. I would definitely recommend cutting the ball down to 2 and running 3 copies of the Frieza Xeno instead, because you can grab the ball back from your drop area with the Dabura, but you can't revive Frieza from the drop area, which I recently found out. So I definitely recommend cutting down the ball to 2 and running 3 copies of the Frieza Xeno instead. The only reason that I haven't done that is because I don't own the 3rd copy of the Frieza yet, so I wasn't able to do that for this particular profile. But this sort of chain is what really pushes your combos into next level, because once you have your Dark Broly Unison down, you can +2, you're both discarding a card. You discard Dodoria, revive Dodoria, draw a card off Healing Pod, your opponent KOs a card from the +2, you play out Surprise Attack Frieza, you ditch Dabura, minus a marker off of your Unison to grab the ball. Your opponent discards again from Dark Broly's auto because he lost a Unison, a marker from the skill. And then you have a 15k crit swing. You can use your leader's activate main to sack off the Dodoria that you revived to then make your Dark Broly crit and then rip a 3rd card out of your opponent's hand. And then you're swinging 20k double strike crit, 15k crit, and then you can use your ball to evolve into your Frieza, which is a double strike, and then can take a further card out of your opponent's hand and add back a Dormant Potential from your drop area. So that's what really pushes your combos into some really insane plays. And on turn 3 and turn 4, when you've got that Dark Broly Unison established, you can rip like 4 and 5 cards out of your opponent's hand and then swing with like 3 crit swings and some double strikes. It's really insane what this deck can do. And then to push even further into the hand control of the deck, I'm just running 4 copies of the Android 18 Bionic Blitz. This is partly because a lot of the good green super combos like Paragus and like the Great Saiyan Man are Saiyans, and so you obviously can't run them because your leader's permanent on the front side restricts you from not playing any Saiyans. And so this is kind of your next best option, because you want to you're like purely a hand control deck, and then this guy can just take the last card out of your opponent's hand sometimes, and it's just really frustrating because your opponent's going to be on a low hand size throughout most of the game, and so once they start swinging into you and trying to gain their hand back up, you can just super combo out, and then your opponent has to bottom deck one. It's really nice. Something I have been thinking about is toying with the idea of running a green-yellow variant of this deck with the green-yellow Android 13 that came out in Evolution Booster, along with some Jiro super combos. Because Jiro super combo is obviously really good in this deck because you have a bunch of drop area recursion with Zarbon, with Dodoria. And you could maybe run some Ribrians in there as well. The only reason I haven't is just because I think that this pure green version is probably better in terms of just general matchup spread. And it will be a lot more consistent to run it mono green because you don't have to worry about charging or anything like that. Because you don't ever want to be stuck in a situation where you have a bunch of green-yellow cards in hand and you have to charge your only Dodoria. Because Dodoria is a massively key card for this deck. And then for the last card in the deck that I'm running, I'm just running the Secret Rare Heroine's Lineage. I think that this is probably one of the best Secret Rares for the deck because obviously your leader's permanent is going to restrict your Secret Rare choice. You can't run like the Great Ape Secret Rare. There's a couple of others that you can't run that I can't really think of right now. I think you can run Supreme Kai of Time, but I don't think Supreme Kai of Time is as good as Heroine's Lineage in this deck. And I think you can also run the new, I think it's a Kibito Kai that came out, the 2 energy that you can play him and steal your opponent's Unison. And I would definitely recommend trying out that new Secret Rare that came out, because I think that that card could be really good in this deck. I just don't own it. And I think Heroine's Lineage is probably your next best bet, because it will help you against those aggressive matchups, but it'll also help against control matchups, because you can take things like the 5-drop baby. It just offers you that extra line of defense when you have 1 energy open and you've used Dormant Potential already, but you're about to maybe die to a big battle card swing. It just helps you in that extra line of defense, and it can also help you in those when you're trying to push for game, if you want to just take some combo power off their board or something like that. But Heroine's Lineage is obviously especially good in a simplified game state, and this deck as a hand control deck aims to reach that simplified game state where both of you are top decking and you don't have any cards in hand. So Heroine's Lineage is really going to shine in this deck. That's the entire deck for you guys. I want to go over some cards that I would consider and why I didn't choose to run them in this deck. Obviously, Ribrian is a huge miss out for this deck, and as a hand control deck, most hand control decks are going to be running Ribrian because it's such a good card. The reason that I'm not running it is just because 2 energy is even more expensive than 1 energy, and 1 energy is super expensive for this deck. And the reason being because you can be cycling Zarbon and Dodoria for 2 energy, so you kind of don't want to be doing that or you kind of don't want to be using Ribrian instead, because you can cycle Zarbon and Dodoria, and that will give you like 2 draws, or it'll give you a draw, 2 bodies on board, and cards to sack off for your unit or for your leader skill. So that's just more value than your opponent discarding a card. And that's the reasoning behind that, basically. Also, I just didn't really have the space, but I think that Ribrian is not a card that you need to run in this deck because it's just too expensive, honestly. And then another kind of honorable mention that I want to give is just to Overwhelms in general. Obviously, this card that I'm using you can't run in this deck, and that's the main point that I have for most of the good Overwhelms. You can't run Saiyans in the deck, so you can't run cards like SS3 Son Goku, Man on a Mission, you can't run Secret Identity Masked Saiyan, you can't run the SS4 Bardock that has dual attack. You can't run a lot of the good Overwhelms in this deck. I think the only Overwhelm that I'd probably consider running that I've seen would be the Dark Temptation Tower, the 3-drop that your opponent discards a card and gives your leader a buff. That card is really good, and it probably works kind of well in this deck. The reason that I'm not running it is because, first of all, it's a black card, so it's going to make your charge is a little bit difficult, and your charging is already really tricky in this deck because you don't want to charge a lot of your key cards. But also, Overwhelm in general in this deck is kind of not very good because you have so much drop area recursion and so many drop area effects over the course of each of your turns that if you Overwhelm and warp your copies of Dodoria or your copies of Zarbon or your copies of the other Zarbon that gives your guys plus 10k power for the battle, it can really be detrimental to your game plan throughout the game, and it can really hurt this deck. So I just haven't been running overarms in this deck because I don't think it's worth it. And then the final card that I was considering running was a copy or two of this Vegeta Unison. The only reason that I'm not is because we already have 7 copies of a Unison cards in this deck, and so I think taking it up to 8 or 9 would make the deck really clunky. But I would definitely recommend side decking this card. I think this card is really, really strong, and it's obviously going to be good in a hand control deck like this, where the double strike crit pressure is going to put in a lot of work. And being able to offer your deck a board to clear is really nice, because this deck kind of struggles with having much removal, because other than the Dark Broly Unison +2, this deck doesn't really have that much consistent removal. So I definitely recommend side decking this card if you're planning to play this deck in any sort of competitive event. But that pretty much wraps it up for the deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed. This is definitely a very fun deck to play. It's a very skill intensive deck to play, I'd argue, because there's a lot of decision points that you have to make with all of your drop area effects versus playing cards out from your hand. Yeah, the deck is really... Oh, something I forgot to mention as well is that I love about this deck is that Surprise Attack Frieza is actually searchable because of your 1-drop Zarbon that searches the top 5 for a 4-cost or less Frieza's army. So you can search Surprise Attack Frieza from that effect. But yeah, this deck has some really intricate combos. I definitely recommend giving it a try if you're looking for something fun to bring to your locals or something. You could definitely take this deck to an event and probably do pretty well with it if you were a very, very good player. But I think that this deck is probably more of a fun one. I might try and take this to an event at some point because I really enjoy the deck. I've had my eye on it for a long time. But for now, I just recommend trying it out and seeing how you do with it. If you guys are interested in staying updated with the channel at all, check out all of the links in the description, and like, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. If you didn't like the video, dislike it and give me a reason why in the comments down below. But that's it from me. Hope you enjoyed the deck profile, and I will see you guys in the next one.